This is an obituary, not an apology. Let that clearly be kept in mind. This is the piece I've been waiting some years to post publicly, rendered into English from my original German. Let it serve as a confrontation to the extremists to the left and to the right, who will never grasp, being useful idiots of advanced degree, what an American Jew is doing, stumping quite publicly and tirelessly for German patriotism and democratic sovereignty, and supporting above all a party like the AfD. This is a story about healing, and the small number of people I've ever shared it with, German and American, Jewish and non-Jewish, even survivors of the Shoa, have been markedly moved by it. Obituary for the most unlikely of friends. Obituary for an awakened former SS officer from Auschwitz, and concerning our one-time correspondence. Translated from my own German rendering of events published and recorded here prior to this. Born 10th of June 1921, deceased 9th of March 2018. On March 9th, 2018, a man died whose kind acquaintance I had made 13 years ago. Alone on the occasion of his passing would I share this very personal exchange so publicly. In January 2005, when I was about to dispose of a Bild tabloid newspaper in a patient's room, I'd glanced at the front page and stood stock still. I'd read in large print, "Just don't let anyone say he didn't know anything. I was an SS man in Auschwitz." And there under his picture from that period, in uniform as administrator of confiscated personal effects, now in interview at age 83, was Mr. Oskar Gröning. I'd immediately read with astonishment how he'd spoken clearly and authentically about his life and his remorse, and more interestingly, his determination to talk openly about it, to testify against deniers, and about the threat calls he'd received, letters threatening his life, and public pressure from old Nazi associations, from Nazi admirers, and from real right-wing deniers. He'd wished once in his lifetime to meet once again face to face with a Jew, asking for forgiveness or pardon, to extend hands with him. I think I wept. As often happens to me, I had much to say, directly and exclusively, to Gröning himself. That same day, I wrote my letter to him. Called up the Bild office, explained what it was about, why I was sending this to their editorial address, and they assured me they'd forward the letter to him. I wrote in about 2 handwritten pages a bit about myself, Jewish American, stationed in Berlin from 88 to 94, etc. And that I'd occupied myself since decades concerning the Nazi years and the Holocaust, and how urgently important it was for me. That the onus of all that be lifted from the shoulders and psyches of the post-war generations. I told him how deeply his interview had affected me. I literally told him that I had never considered a day that I had never considered a day ever in my lifetime when I'd be confronted with a former Nazi standing before me, asking for forgiveness of all things, since, as we know, a Nazi would never know remorse anyway. Until now. Until Oskar Gröning showed up. And I, whose interest has been in real, objective healing, found myself confronted here with a bit of a miracle. I wrote, "You may be the Nazi I've been waiting for over 16 years. I made it clear to him how impressed I was, how sincerely authentic I found him, and that even though it was not my place to even pardon him, much less forgive, since I was not one of the victims, and had lost no family. However, in just this, it was within my power and within my responsibility to share with him my understanding and support, to reach out and offer my shoulder, as authentic a statement as was his own. Although my habit was to photocopy any outgoing letter, this time happened to be an exception, as I'd expected nothing more and wanted to get it out in the mail as soon as possible. Since at 85 and so harassed as he was, who could say how long he'd hold out? I'd written many people in my time in high positions and gotten some answers, all of which I still have an original. I once wrote the Pope, got an answer. I once wrote the then sitting German President Weizsäcker, got an answer. Well, shortly after this dispatch, I got an answer from Oskar Gröning. The original with envelope I have on file. So, here is the full content of that letter, dated March 15th, 2005, rendered in English here and complete as it is, including his additional handwritten notations. Oskar Gröning. Dear Mr. Inayat-Chisti, this greeting, first computer typed, like the body of the letter itself, then crossed out and rewritten by hand. I received your letter of 6 February of this year. I would like to thank you for your lines as they stand out clearly from the contents of other letters I've received on this subject in the last 20 years. It was not always enjoyable. For the first time, I went public with my statements in the Bild interview, but in 1985, I had an unpleasant contact with neo-Nazis. An acquaintance I had met at a gathering of stamp collectors doubted the truth of the Holocaust and gave me as his proof a brochure, The Auschwitz Lie, by a German Dane named Christopherson. I read the booklet at home and gave it back to the man by writing comprehensive notes into this pamphlet, page by page, with no date, no signature, and so forth. He should learn a few things from it. Weeks later, I learned that this man had sent the author, Christopherson, this comment as a letter to the editor, a supposed letter to the editor from me, who in turn published it in his neo-Nazi monthly, The Peasantry, with my phone number as provided by the sender. I then had telephone terror for weeks. That was publicity enough. In addition, I had to appear 3 times as a witness before regional courts to give testimony concerning Auschwitz. That too was not easy. Concerning myself, I grew up, born 1921, in a household that was national, not National Socialist. My father had served in the First World War and was severely wounded in 1915. He lost an eye through shrapnel from a hand grenade. Our family, mother died in 1924. I still had a brother who was fatally wounded in Russia, in Stalingrad, at the age of 22. Was not wealthy, and so I had a youth, although with good education, banking, that was not rosy. When Hitler came to power in 1933, 5 million unemployed were on the street. He gave them work in a work service for road construction and more land cultivation. That made an impression. The other measures were also well received by the population because having work, bread, and a little money is always good for the mood of the people. The only bad thing known to anyone, was that Hitler simply imprisoned people who were against him in concentration camps. We hadn't known where that would lead. In the Hitler Youth, we hiked, sang songs, and celebrated at the campfire. We could hike with little money throughout Germany or on a bike. Overnighted for 35 pfennigs in a youth hostel. It was a nice time for us. When the war came, we were told that the bad guys had started this war because they were envious. We were ready to defend what we had achieved, with weapon in hand. So, I entered the Waffen-SS with a kind of exultation, because that was an elite group, like the Leathernecks in the US. Who didn't want to be there? And one day I got an order to the front in Russia. No. I found myself one morning in October 1942 in Auschwitz. This is my story. You will ask whether we hadn't rebelled against the concentration camps and the synagogue fires. The Jews, according to our indoctrination, were the bad guys who had started the First World War, were responsible for the Treaty of Versailles, which deaths resulted in massive starvation and unemployment and so on. That in a small town on the Weser, the desecration of a synagogue did not attract much attention was the result of indoctrination, in which everything German was good and everything foreign was bad. There was still no radio, no television, and only newspapers, all controlled by Hitler via Goebbels. From where should we know the truth? From where should we know the truth? I first awoke from those dreams of my youth in Auschwitz and started to think critically. Let it be noted, the one interruption I want to make, let it be noted, he put in 3 times for transfer out of there. Transfer to anywhere, even the front, especially the front. This is on record. This is on record. All 3 requests were denied. Dear Mr. Inayat-Chisti, thank you for your letter. The content touched me so emotionally that I cried the first time I read it. How can I find understanding and even assistance from a person whose people have been persecuted as cruelty as I have experienced witnessing? I have always imagined that one day I would be able to shake hands with the citizen of your people, without words, just as a gesture. With your letter, this has come true. That which I have wished for. Thank you. Thank you very much. I am very much tormented by the thought of finding forgiveness. I have come to the conclusion that ultimately only our Lord God can take away my remorse and pardon me and forgive me. Nevertheless, it is comforting to know that one is not alone with one's thoughts and feelings. That someone who introduces himself comes and says, I believe you. and I am ready to shake your hand. I am not guilty in the sense of a committed crime, and yet I am guilty, or have become guilty of others on account of others who have seduced me and let me share in the guilt against the people, against human beings, against women and children. Dear Mr. Inayat-Chisti, you extend your hand to me and pray with me in the request of forgiveness. You take my hand and comfort me by pardoning me on your own account. For others of your people you cannot speak. It is still good to know that there is one person in the world who supports me in my thoughts, even though he is a Jew. There is still a difficult time ahead of me. 2 years ago, I allowed a Berlin historian to visit me and ask me questions about the Holocaust. It turned out that he acted on behalf of the British BBC, which wanted to make a documentary of a different kind about the Holocaust. They were looking for witnesses of the time, eyewitnesses of whom there are always fewer with the passing of time. It is my concern to take action against the deniers of the Holocaust, of whom there are more and more, such as are seduced by the neo-Nazis. That's why I volunteered to tell the truth on camera, unvarnished, as cruel as it really was. The taping was completed in 2004. The 6-part film is running currently in the UK, in France, and in the US. This is 2005. Yeah? That was also the occasion for my interview in the Bild paper. At the beginning of the series broadcast on BBC Two in England, 3 pages of The Guardian and Daily Express were reported on me. Since I had not been warned that the releases could have consequences for me in Germany, newspaper reporters came in droves to get an interview. In Germany, this series will probably be broadcast in April or May. With agreement from the BBC, I then decided to grant Bild one single interview, because with this tabloid sheet you reach the neo-Nazis. Insofar, it was correct to take a position against the deniers, just so. Meanwhile, I have interview offers from all over Germany and Europe, but I have stated once all that I have to say and stand by that. However, I do not want to be passed around like a circus monkey and become famous. For reasons of principle, this also applies to the many written questions. It is just too much. Dear Mr. Inayat-Chisti, it was and is very important for me to have received your letter. The Bild editors recognized that, and therefore just forwarded your letter to me. I bow to your offer to assist me. That sounded as honest as I myself have reported. Nonetheless, I, an old man who still gets at most 10 lines of writing without trembling, cannot satisfy my own urge to keep in touch with you. Your letter will not end up in the bin, but will be kept by me. I will read it again and again, especially when I feel down. I will also show it to my children. I assume that I may. They are already 60 and 55 years old. The rest is handwritten in his own hand. Let us embrace you in warmth. I am pleased to have been in contact with you. Your letter is more valuable to me than many eulogies. I hold you tightly to my heart, and I am your Oskar Gröning. In April 2015, my Oskar Gröning was pulled again in his lifetime, now nearing 95, into the new Auschwitz trial. But now according to the dictates of Merkel and Justice Inquisitor Maas, where he was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. During this trial, I, now with my Ramona, did not abandon my one-time correspondent. We wrote him together, 2 letters sent to him via his lawyer, with our support. Not as any kind of SS admirers, but as a private couple. An American Jew and a Berliner whose grandparents and their pastor and their deacon were active in the resistance, and had sacrificed more than all the deniers of today and all the leftist socialists or the Antifa would ever have the spine to put on the line. To hang a collective guilt on him for murder and condemn him for that is an imposition on the judicial order of a constitutional state and an absurdity. In all previous trials of Auschwitz or other concentration camps or death camp matters, it has always been about individual guilt. It speaks volumes about the Merkel state, with Maass as Federal Minister of Justice and the promotion of Stasi staff under former Stasi EM Merkel, and that nothing adheres any longer to the basic law. Their red-green's communist zeal leading to tossing everything into one heap before the last chance for their self-edifying fight against the Nazis escapes them. A mere left instrumentalization of today's banana republic of Germany. Moreover, precisely under Merkel and her red-green's climate of groupthink dictatorship, a mass, well-functioning lemming mentality is firmly in place, which means one has so little spine, so little moral courage today to stand against a third German socialist dictatorship in history, as little as at the end of the Weimar period against the brown socialists or against the red socialists. Because today we see a Fourth Reich spirit looming pervasively and clearly before us. A couple of last notations. Eva Moses Kor, one of the survivors witnessing for the prosecution against Oskar Gröning, spoke of her willingness to regard him as a human being and forgave him during the trial. So I wasn't so far off, was I? She said, but I did not relieve him of his responsibility. He still has to assume that himself. And there is a very moving newspaper photo of them sitting together, encountering each other in an extremely human way. Under his then current health and legal circumstances, no further word from him would be expected. And so it remained. He had probably received our letters through his lawyer, and that had sufficed. Also present as observer was a notoriously celebrated Holocaust denier, an 89-year-old woman named Haberbeck, who toward the end of the trial had been asked on camera what she thought of his testimony. Well, she replied, with a cynical smirk, he's an old man. His memory is failing him. When approached shortly after by a reporter and told of her comment, Mr. Gröning looked over his shoulder with a long, weary expression and a shaking of his head and answered merely, some people just cannot be helped. Neither the Haberbecks nor the so-called social justice warriors